In this video, I'm going to show you how HDR in dynamic lighting conditions can affect the levels of noise in your final image. Now, before we start, I want to make it clear that what I'm talking about here is taking multiple exposures, bracketing multiple exposures, and combining them into a single high dynamic range image. I'm not talking about the tone-mapped HDR look that most people are familiar and associate with the term HDR. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. I wanted to see if you could benefit from using HDR in dynamic lighting conditions like this here, when you inevitably pull out lost details from the shadows and the highlights that are blown out that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to get out of a raw image, a single raw image at least, which is where HDR comes in. Now, raw files have a really large exposure latitude, meaning that you can pull out detail from the shadows or the highlights that you may have thought you lost, but are still actually there, just hidden away in the raw files. Now, even raw files have a limit to how much detail you could pull out before it's just lost in all the grain and the noise that you're inevitably going to see. One of the benefits of HDR is that you can do, the definition of HDR is multiple exposure, like you're bracketing multiple exposures. So you would take a single image that would be the correct exposure, where you're exposing for the midtones in the image like this here. And then you would take an image that's generally like 1 to 2, maybe even 3 stops darker and also brighter than you would normally do for a correct exposure. That way you can see the details that are in the highlights and also in the shadows. And then you would take these into a software like Photomatix or Photoshop, or what I'm using here is Lightroom, and you would combine them, and in post you could actually bring out those shadows and not lose it to the noise, and also the highlights as well, at least in theory. I wanted to see how well that actually worked, so I'm going to take you into Lightroom here, and I'm going to show you the level of noise that you're going to get after doing a 3-shot HDR and a 5-shot HDR with an 8-stop range, meaning I went 4 stops down and 4 stops up, as well as 2 in between, just to get an extra level of detail in there at ISO 400 and also ISO 1600. And if you're wondering why I only went to ISO 1600, is because the camera I was using with this was an old Rebel that only went up to 3200. And 3200 on that Rebel is pretty much Lego Vision, so I didn't do that. Anyway, let's go into Lightroom and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Alright, now that we're in Lightroom here, you'll notice that I have 2 sets that are color-coded. I have these blue ones here and the green ones. The blue ones were shot at ISO 400 and the green ones were shot at ISO 1600. Now, this shot here, the first one in the series of the blue ones here, is the correct exposure. That is the exposure the camera says this is what you want to expose for if you want the correct exposure. Now, of course, the highlights are blown out and the shadows are lost, but this is exposing for the midtones here. And then I took a 2 stops underexposed photo and a 2 stops overexposed photo. And then I combined all 3 of these into one HDR, which is this one here. Then I also took 4 stops, underexposed and 4 stops overexposed, and I combined all of these minus that HDR here, all of those here into an HDR shot here. And the same thing here on the ISO 1600 shots. This is the correct exposure, again air quotes, 2 stops underexposed, 2 over, HDR of those 3, 4 over, 4 under, and the HDR of those 5. Okay. Now, none of these have been edited. These are all just, straight out of the camera, except for the HDRs, which all I did was compile them in Lightroom here. I didn't do any toning. I didn't do any kind of fixing whatsoever, so just the original photos. Then I also have snapshots of the photos. I'm going to flatten all of the photos here, which means I'm going to lower the highlights and raise the shadows, so then you can see the detail in the highlights and the shadows there. And you'll see how the noise gets affected in those areas once the again, the highlights are lowered and the shadows are raised. Also then, I denoise the original one here, and we're going to compare the just one singular raw file with both this HDR and this HDR, as well as on the ISO 1600 shots as well, just to see if denoising, using any denoising profiles and any things like that, would actually make it more comparable to the output of what an HDR is going to get you. And then I also stylized everything, so what I would normally do when I go through and edit everything and how I would do it for each of the photos, and then I'll show you how the noise affects those as well. So let's get started. First off, we're going to take the original raw file here. That's the exposing for the correct exposure. Then we're going to take the 3-shot HDR here. We're going to go down to compare. And you'll notice that there's definitely a little bit of noise here. It's not entirely noticeable, but it is still there. Not as noticeable here in the HDR, although there is still a little bit here. You can notice a little bit more here in the shadows in the case. But let's take this, let's flatten it out, and I'll show you what that looks like then. And this is the flat image. Now, I didn't do anything other than raising the shadows and lowering the highlights, and you can already tell that a single raw file here isn't holding up nearly as well as the HDR shot. It's a lot cleaner. There's definitely still some noise, but it's a lot cleaner than a single raw file. You can hear in the highlights and everything like that. Let's zoom out. Oops, excuse me. Zoom out. Zoom down here, it's not really noticeable. You're not gonna really be able to tell the difference, like, oh man, there's so much noise in this image, until of course you zoom in. And that's to be expected. While you can get a lot out of a single raw file, it's actually pretty amazing the amount of things that you can get out of a raw file. It's still not going to hold up as well as a 3-shot, completely raw HDR file here. The reason is because, remember the photo we had before of the 2 shots, or 2 stops overexposed, is going to, which means it's exposing for the shadows here. So all that detail was there in that shot. And so that shot is what the HDR is going to take. So it's going to remove all the noise by just layering over top that exposure. As well as here in the highlights, you're going to lose some of the noise up in here because of the 2 stops underexposed, that you got all the detail that was in the highlights. Now let's take a look at what a 5-stop HDR would do with 4 stops down and 4 stops up, as well as 2 down and 2 up. So here now on the left we have the 3-shot HDR, and this is the 5-shot HDR. Let's take a look at the level of noise in the 3-shot HDR compared to getting even more detail out of the 5-shot here. Now you'll notice it's not as big of a difference as the 3-shot compared to the single raw file here, but there is still definitely some noise that gets removed in the 5-shot. Also, yes, there is chromatic aberration, which can be easily fixed, but that's more a product of the lens, not the HDR or the raw file itself. Also, yeah, so you can see some of the noise here. There's still definitely noise, and it's not that much of an improvement. Now let's go back to the original single raw file, and I'm going to do some denoising and a little bit of sharpening as well, and see if we can get the single shot HD or single shot raw file to look comparable to either of the noise levels in these HDR shots. So now we have the single shot raw file with some denoising and everything, as well as the 5-shot HDR file over here. And you'll notice this is a drastic improvement, and actually when I first did this, I was surprised at how much noise you can actually remove in some of this noise canceling software and things. So that surprised me, and while there's still definitely noise, a lot of the color noise got removed. So it looks a little more like film grain as opposed to digital noise. Not quite exactly the same, but still a lot better. And actually, if you just took a single raw file and used denoising, and even if you flattened everything out like this is still entirely usable. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. It was usable before anything too, but this is more usable. But of course, you know, with denoising, everything like that, there's a lot of that detail was lost. So it kind of gets this soft, mushy kind of feel to it. While it's not noisy anymore, there's still definitely more detail over here in the HDR as opposed to the single raw file. But that's pretty damn impressive, I think, personally. Alright, now let's move on to the ISO 1600 shots here, the green ones. And I'm going to go through in the exact same way that I just did with those. And you're going to see probably, and by probably I mean definitely because I've already looked at them obviously, a bigger difference in noise levels. Obviously, it's, you know, 2 more stops extra of noise. Alright, so we're going to take the original shot here and the HDR here. Now, once again, these are completely unedited other than the HDR stacking here, no toning or anything like that. And this is the correct exposure here, the single raw file, and this is the 2 stops underexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and this raw file HDR combined here. And you'll notice there's significantly more noise, even before flattening everything and bringing up the shadows and bringing down the highlights. There's definitely a lot more noise over here. Although over here, it's pretty hard to tell that there's any noise whatsoever, which is actually pretty impressive. Now, let's go into, well, let me flatten everything out for both of these here, and we'll compare the noise levels for that. And wow, that is a lot of noise in the single raw file. Definitely some noise over here, but there's a lot over here. You know, just a decent amount. And again, all I did was raise the shadows and lower the highlights. It's not quite glaucoma-induced Lego vision, but noisy. Pretty much all of the detail that was here, that you can see over here, yeah, it's gone. It's not there. Let's move over to here. This lens, oh, is that a lens or is that just a giant pixel of noise? Yeah. So you can definitely already see the benefits of HDR for a higher ISO, and by higher I do mean higher since the max ISO natively caps out at 3200 on this camera. So for this camera, this is a high ISO. Maybe not for more modern, newer cameras. The benefits of HDR, even for just a 3-shot HDR, which is what this one is as opposed to the 5-shot, is pretty astounding. Now let's add some denoising to this photo here and see if we can maybe salvage some of the detail that was lost in the noise. And there's definitely not, well, there's definitely a lot less noise, I guess, mostly color noise, but there's a lot of detail lost, like a lot. This kind of just turns to black. There's no weather pattern here at all. It's definitely a little harder to tell things. There's still noise, of course, over in this one here, but the detail here in the shadows is much more salvageable. Over here in the highlights, it's not necessarily as big of a deal, but definitely in the shadows. Now let's compare that to the 5-shot HDR and see if we can get even more noise benefits from it. Now here we have the 5-shot HDR, the single raw file over here, and this is of course 2 stops under, 2 stops over, 4 stops under, and 4 stops overexposed, combined into a single HDR shot, as well as the standard correctly exposed raw file here. And you'll notice that there's like no noise. Okay, there's definitely noise, but there's like no real noticeable noise. And of course, all of these photos I am 1:1 cropped into these photos. So zoomed out, it's not going to be as much of a difference. There's definitely some color changes here because of all the noise, but this is after denoising as well in this photo. But let's zoom back in here and look at this. Like that, the detail you still get out of that 5-shot HDR, even at ISO 1600, compared to what you're going to get out of a raw file, is pretty astounding, actually. Like, this is friggin' buttery smooth. It's ridiculous. Even here with the 3-shot HDR compared to the 5-shot HDR, like, the noise levels are still pretty astounding. Of course, you know, much less of a difference than what you would get out of the single raw file compared to either one of these HDRs, but that's still pretty impressive. Now here's the single raw file where I did all my edits on, and I synced all of these settings over to this 5-shot HDR over here. They're exactly the same. There's no difference whatsoever, other than the fact that this is in HDR and this is not in HDR. So right off the bat here, zoomed out, you can tell that, well, at least my preference here, I definitely like this one over this one here. This is kind of has a little bit more contrast, which is what I like to go for. Of course, you know, your mileage may vary if you're not particularly a fan of the way I edit things. You know, the benefits you're going to get out of denoising that HDR does naturally might not be exactly the same as the benefits that I would get out of it. So let's zoom in here. And yes, there is still some noise everywhere. Got rid of that chromatic aberration, so there's that. There's a little bit left. But after stylizing everything, doing denoising and all that stuff, it's not quite as flat, obviously. It's the opposite of flat. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of what we think of as HDR, since it's so heavy in the contrast. It's kind of like LDR. But there's still, even though I go the exact I go in the exact opposite direction of what most people think HDR is, again, thanks to tone mapping and things like that, I still see potential benefits from the removal of noise here. Although, honestly, it's not a deal breaker. If I had the option to shoot in HDR here, I would probably, I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, why not? I'll do it. Unless, of course, didn't feel like taking the time to edit, because, of course, time is money, and you're taking a lot more time with all the rendering and also putting the HDRs together in the first place with the HDR than you would on a single raw file. And honestly, this is good enough. Of course, this is the ISO 400 one. Next here, we're going to look at my stylized 1600 shots with the raw file here and the 5-shot HDR on this side. So here we have the single shot raw file here and the 5-shot HDR over here. And again, right off the bat, I personally prefer the 5-shot HDR over the single raw file, just from a zoomed out standpoint, because the color differences are slightly different, and of course, that's because of the level of noise that you're going to get in here. It will affect the actual, not just the quality based on, you know, all the noise, but the color and everything like that, including the contrast. Now let's zoom on in. Zoom on in. Zoom on in here, and there's definitely a lot of noise in here. Even after I denoised, I didn't go crazy with the denoising because I didn't want it to be completely mush. But yeah, honestly, I don't think I would use this photo. Now, this is probably still an acceptable level of noise for most people. Excuse me, for most people, unless, of course, you're using this shot for like maybe commercial purposes, where this is probably entirely unacceptable. But even for me, I obviously preferred this, and if I had the option to do this, the HDR of the single, I would probably do it, but still, like 90% of the time, I'm well, more like 99% of the time, let's be honest here, I'm probably not going to take the time to do all of this because, again, time is money, and this takes a lot of time to render on my computer because I've got like a 7.5-year-old computer. It, when it came out, top of the line, not so much anymore. So it does take a lot longer. And if I'm going to do a multitude of shots, all in HDR, all 5-shot, or even more HDR, that is going to take a lot of time to do. Now, really, I just wanted to point out the potential benefits and see if you could possibly apply them to your work or anything that you do, and maybe this will help you in some way. And it's definitely very useful, as you've seen the noise differences between the single shot RAW, I keep saying that, the single shot RAW file and the 3-shot and 5-shot HDRs are pretty drastic. So just a little food for thought for someone who wants to go even further in their denoising of their images. There are some people that only ever shoot at ISO 100 or even ISO 50 and want no noise whatsoever and go through all these different noise processing, noise software processing everything so that there's not even a pixel of noise in the image whatsoever. This would benefit those people. You're crazy, but I love you. But anyway, that'll do it for this video here. I hope it helped you out in some way or another. At least you learned a little something. And, at the end of the day, isn't that what life is all about? I like to think life is all about learning. Anyway, if you like the video, then go ahead and hit the like button and show me that, well, you like the video, and it really helps me out if you hit the subscribe button as well. You'll get updated for more videos like this, or dealing with creativity and cultivating creative mindset, or other tutorials for Photoshop or Lightroom, or just photography techniques in general. Occasionally I'll throw in a review here and there, and you can find me on all of the normal social media outlets, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also my website, rightlighting.com, where I have everything written out, so if you prefer to read as opposed to watch and listen, then, well, I have that option for you. But yeah, so until the next video, take care, and I'll see you later.